All right, everybody. Oh, thank you. Welcome to the Fourth Liberty Pub. I see some familiar faces, so thank you all for those who came back out. I see some people from our first talk from Matt Kibbe's organization, Free the People, so thanks, guys. Just welcome, give you a quick background. This is Liberty Pub. We're run out of RRLS, or the Ronald Reagan Lecture Series. We're just trying to get this kind of off the ground in the Arlington area. We have, just to give you a heads up, we do have a Constitution Day picnic out in Sterling, September 17th. If you're interested, we'd love for you to come out. Just hang out. Food's provided, potluck recommended. And then in October, we are going to have a panel on immigrations with three individuals who have immigrated here from, I believe, Russia and a few other Eastern European countries, speaking on just immigration to the U.S. So check out our website, rrls.us, for info on that. And I'm going to introduce Matthew Bergstrom, who supports our organization and is going to be introducing our speaker, Ilya.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Hello. Raise your hand if this is your first Liberty Pub. Raise your hand if this is your second, third, fourth. Wow, excellent. That's so great. Well, I think, I know, speaking from my personal experience, I can say there's proof that this has been a success. I live in Arlington. I was yearning for events and gatherings like this to happen with people like yourselves. In fact, tonight's speaker is my neighbor. It's thrilling that these kind of events are drawing us together, and I really appreciate Ronald Reagan Lecture Series for helping sponsor the Liberty Pub, and Michael's efforts as well. He's worked very hard. But congratulations to Michael. So, in introducing tonight's speaker, Ilya and his wife and their young daughter do live just 5 minutes away, along with their golden retriever, Willow, right? So, he's a professor at George Mason University's Law School, recently renamed the Antonin Scalia School of Law, but they realized the acronym was a little inconvenient. But he's an adjunct scholar also at the Cato Institute, and he's a blogger. I think many of you know his work. He's a blogger with the Blog Conspiracy. He's a former co-editor of the Supreme Court Economic Review. Ilya was born in the Soviet Union. At age 5, he migrated along with his family to the USA, and from my perspective, his observations sometimes draw on his memory of the material poverty in the USSR and his insights to ideological indoctrination by totalitarian regimes. Ilya received his BA in political science and history from Amherst College, his master's in political science from Harvard, and his JD from Yale. His research focuses on constitutional law, property law, and the study of popular political participation and its implications for constitutional democracy. His publications include the 2015 book, The Grasping Hand, Kilo versus City of New London and the Limits of Eminent Domain. He was the co-author of the 2013 book, A Conspiracy Against Obamacare, the Blood Conspiracy in the Healthcare Case. He is a co-editor of the forthcoming book, Eminent Domain and Comparative Perspective. Is that right? Ilya has testified before the U.S. Senate on the use of drones for targeted killing in the war. He returned to the Senate to testify on property rights issues during the confirmation hearings for Supreme Court Justice Somin. I encourage you all to follow Ilya on Twitter and on the Blood Conspiracy at the Washington Post. Some of his recent blogs include the following: How to put an end to the dark side of the Olympics. Can Trump be trusted on judicial appointments? Gary Johnson, libertarianism and originalism. Immigration and political freedom. This is a doozy. 7 fantasy/science fiction epics that can inform you about the real-world political scene. How Trump strengthens the forces of political correctness. Is the overflow of a democratically elected government ever justified? And finally, remembering the biggest mass murderer in the history of the world. Spoiler alert, Mao did it. And I just also want to remind you, we do have these Stop Socialism buttons available for a donation, along with Ilya's book in the back, so afterward, get that signed. And on a final note, introducing tonight's topic, Ilya's work on political ignorance, or a study of the topic, has stretched back for 15 years. And it's just perfect timing during this political season that the second edition came out just this summer. The book, Democracy and Political Ignorance, Why Smaller Government is Smarter, has actually been translated into Italian and Japanese, but the version we have tonight is in English, I can assure you of that. So without further delay, I want to turn over to my friend and my neighbor, Ilya Somin. Thank you so much for coming.
So I'd like to thank Matthew and Michael and all of you for having me here. And also I'd like to thank the candidates in this year's presidential election for making the study of political ignorance great again. As Matthew mentioned, I've been researching and writing about these issues for not even 15 years now, actually 18 years or more. However, it has never been more relevant than in this election year, though I should note that in other election years it certainly hasn't been absent. It's just that it's even greater than it was before. So it's not quite making it great again, it's actually making it even greater. So in this presentation, I'll just give you a brief overview of the book, and I'm happy to open it up for questions. I'll start out by talking a little bit about the vast extent of political ignorance that exists in American society today, and I'll also talk a little about why we should care about the political ignorance that is out there. Then I'll talk about how most of the ignorance that we see out there, it's actually the result of rational behavior by individual voters. It's not because the voters are stupid or because information is unavailable. For the most part, it's perfectly rational, which is not to say that it's a good thing. Now, some people say we don't really need to worry about political ignorance because even if the voters don't know too much, they can use information shortcuts. Small bits of information that stand in for larger bodies of knowledge that they don't know. I'll talk a little bit about how that claim is overblown. In many cases, information shortcuts actually make things worse rather than making them better. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about how we can improve the situation at least somewhat by making more of our decisions through voting with our feet and fewer through voting at the ballot box. That is that we can vote with our feet in a federal system determining where we want to live, and also we can vote with our feet in the market, the private sector, and civil society more generally, and that has important informational advantages over voting at the ballot box. But first things first, why should we even care about this problem of political ignorance in the first place? Some people say it doesn't matter if the voters are ignorant. They can make whatever decisions they want. It's like an individual choice. You may prefer vanilla ice cream over chocolate ice cream. You may not know anything about the ice cream, but it's fine. It's your exercise, your individual freedom. So similarly with, say, Trump versus Hillary, you may not know anything about either of them perhaps, but it's okay. It's just an exercise of individual choice. I think John Stuart Mill, sorry, I have a sore throat today. It's not a reaction to the candidates necessarily. But Mill quite effectively refuted this sort of argument as applied to voting 150 years ago when he pointed out that voting is not purely an individual choice. It's the exercise of power over other people. When we vote in an election, the people we choose don't just govern those who voted for them, they govern the entire society. So unlike in the case of chocolate ice cream or a diet of 6 hamburgers a day that you might ignorantly adopt in the hope that it would actually be good for you, here you're potentially putting the entire society on a diet of bad public policies, potentially even catastrophic ones. In a democratic society, majority opinion has a big influence over government policy. Not the only thing that has an influence, but it does have an effect. So if that opinion tends to be ignorant or illogical, that can have very negative results. And we have good reason to care about it because it's not simply a matter of individual choice in the way that ice cream or hamburgers might be. So then the question arises, how bad is the problem really? Do we in fact have a problem with political ignorance, or are the voters actually well informed? And probably the least controversial part of my book is chapter 1, where I describe the enormous extent of political ignorance in American society today. I'm not going to go over all of the many examples, but I'll just give you a few from recent elections. For instance, in our last election in 2014, the big pointed issue was which party would control the 2 houses of Congress. Yet going into the election, polls showed that only about 38% of the public even knew which party controlled the House of Representatives at the time, and a similar number knew which party controlled the Senate. It's hard to hold them accountable for their performance if you don't even know who's actually in charge in those particular houses of Congress. Similarly, in this year's election, in the 2012 election, and most elections recently, one of the big issues is the future of the federal budget. How are we going to deal with the very serious fiscal problems that we have? But surveys consistently show that most of the public has no idea how the federal government spends its money. They massively underestimate the percentage of spending that goes to big entitlement programs like Medicare and Social Security, two of the largest items in the federal budget. On the other hand, they greatly overestimate by a factor of 10 or even 20 the percentage that goes to foreign aid. Actually, only about 1% of the federal budget. So the average voter implicitly believes if only we could cut that foreign aid spending, our fiscal situation could be solved. And however you feel about foreign aid, this just isn't true. We could zero it out tomorrow. We'd still have much the same fiscal situation that we have now. This kind of ignorance goes beyond specific issues or candidates. It also applies to the basic structure of government. For example, a poll taken last October, November, finds that only 34% of the public can even name the three branches of the federal government: the executive, the legislative, and my favorite as a law professor, the judicial. Only 34% of the public knows what each of these things are. Moreover, a lot of data also indicates that often the voters don't know which officials are responsible for which issues, which of course makes it harder to hold them accountable for their performance. Now, as I suggested at the start of my talk, this problem of political ignorance isn't new. We've seen it in many elections, but its influence is particularly striking in this year's election cycle, even more so than in most others. For example, Donald Trump, the candidate with perhaps the most surprising success in the current election cycle, he famously said, "I love the poorly educated," and well, he should, because political ignorance has been an important factor in his success so far. Doesn't by itself prove that he's a bad candidate or would be a bad president. I personally think both things are true, but whether he's a good candidate or not, political ignorance has been an important factor in his campaign. In fact, almost all of the major issues that have been big focuses of his appeal partake of this. For example, Trump first became famous as a candidate when he made that by now famous or notorious speech about how Mexico is sending us murderers and rapists and therefore increasing the crime rate. In actual fact, every study out there shows that immigrants, including Mexican immigrants, have a much lower crime rate actually than native-born Americans do. They actually lowered the crime rate rather than increasing it. But polls show that 50% of the public and over 70% of Republicans think the opposite is true. They believe falsely that immigration increases crime, and that belief is an important part of Trump's appeal. The other big issue raised by Trump, but also by Bernie Sanders on the other party, is the issue of international trade. And as Trump puts it in his view, we are losers and other countries are winners if we have a trade deficit, say with Mexico or with Japan or Korea. He thinks that if they sell us more goods than we buy from them, then they've somehow defeated us. We have become losers. No serious trade economist believes this to be true. Pretty basic economics shows that our trade deficit with Japan is no more an indication of economic failure than my trade deficit with my local supermarket. I buy a lot more of their products than they buy of my books. Perhaps that makes me a loser in some moral sense, I don't know, but it has no actual economic significance. It says nothing about my political success or failure, yet most voters most of the time don't understand basic economics of trade, and therefore they have the sense that if we are in fact buying more goods than we sell, that somehow is an indication of failure. Maybe it even makes us losers. And both Trump and Bernie Sanders and quite a few other politicians have been successful in making those sorts of arguments. Trump and Sanders also have in common the fact that they essentially both say that we can vastly increase spending, and in the case of Trump, also massively cut taxes, while at the same time either increasing or keeping in place virtually all items of existing federal spending, particularly big entitlement programs. Both of them are sort of playing on this fact that most voters don't realize that big entitlement programs are where most of the spending is, and therefore there's the sense that we can have everything we want in terms of the entitlement programs, and also we can greatly increase spending, in Trump's case, greatly cut taxes, and yet not have any fiscal problems. This math simply doesn't add up in any reasonable sense. Both left and right-wing economists will tell you that it doesn't add up, but most of the public doesn't know. So they find the idea of cutting taxes, increasing spending, leaving entitlement programs alone simultaneously. They think that this is actually feasible, whereas a basic knowledge of the federal budget will show you that it simply isn't. And by the way, to some extent at least, Hillary Clinton has jumped on this particular bandwagon as well. So I think Trump and to some extent Sanders are an extreme example of what we see normally as well and with more ordinary politicians, which is the shameless exploitation of political ignorance by candidates. You can blame the candidates, they deserve blame, but the root of the problem is in fact that the public is ignorant, and therefore they support these sort of things. If they knew more, the candidates would have to run on different platforms, or maybe we would have different candidates in the first place. Now when you hear numbers like this, many people tend to assume the reason why they're so ignorant must be because the voters are idiots, they're stupid, right? They just can't figure this stuff out. Or alternatively, maybe the information just isn't available to us. The evil corporate media, the government, the Koch brothers, the Trilateral Commission, somebody like that has kept the truth from us. And if only it were available, the people would rise up, they'd become informed, and this problem would go away. I think a look at the evidence suggests that neither of these intuitive explanations are true. Far from people being stupid, the data shows that IQ scores have actually gone up over time, but political ignorance has remained roughly the same. Today's levels of political knowledge are about the same as those of 50 years ago were when you look at the data. So people are smarter, but they're not using their intelligence for the most part to acquire political knowledge. It also is not plausible to say that the problem is that the information just isn't out there or that nefarious forces are keeping it from us. To the contrary, thanks to the internet, 24-hour cable TV news, and other modern technology, this information is more easily available than ever before in human history. So the problem is not that the voters are stupid or that the information isn't available. It's that most people are not using their intelligence to seek it out. They're instead doing other kinds of stuff, watching reality TV, watching sports, going out to the bar, having fun, but they're not taking the time, for the most part, to learn political knowledge. And for most people, most of the time, this is actually rational. Imagine that your only reason to acquire political knowledge is to be a better voter, to decide whether Hillary or Trump is superior, whether you prefer to Democrats to Republicans, and so forth. That turns out not to be much of an incentive at all, because the chance that your vote will make a difference in an election is infinitesimally small. In a presidential election, it's about 1 in 60 million. It might be it might be higher than that if you live in a swing state, as Virginia often is, but perhaps this year won't be, so it might be 1 in 10 million in that situation. Might also be higher in a local or state election, but it's still extremely low. So given that low odds, it makes good sense to devote most of your time and effort to other kinds of things. Now, of course, most people don't know these exact numbers, but they do have an intuitive sense that there's very little payoff to acquiring political knowledge to be a better voter. So they flip on to reality TV, the Olympics, the Super Bowl or whatnot, and they don't spend a lot of time following political news. Now, of course, there are some people who find out and learn a lot about various subjects, even though they can't make a difference to the outcome. I refer, of course, to sports fans, the kind of people who like to watch what was on this TV just a moment ago. They watch the games and learn a lot about their favorite teams, not because they think it will affect the outcome of games, but because they find it entertaining. They love hanging out with their fellow fans of the same team. They love cheering on their team, and often they love hating the opposition. And so certainly sports fans learn a lot more about their favorite sports and their favorite teams than most people do. Just as there are sports fans who learn about sports for these kinds of reasons, there are the people that in the book I call political fans. They too find politics interesting and entertaining. They love cheering on their favorite candidates or ideologies or parties. And of course, they love hating the opposing party. Think about the way that partisan Republicans love to hate Obama or Hillary Clinton, or partisan Democrats love to hate the Republicans and Donald Trump and other Republican candidates. So the political fans, the people who are really interested in politics in this way, they tend to know much more than the average voter. And that's not a bad thing. Nothing wrong with being a fan, either a sports fan or a political fan. I'm some of both myself. But there is this problem. When you acquire knowledge for the purpose of enhancing your fan experience, often that objective is very much at odds with the goal of getting at the truth. Think about the way that sports fans react to information that goes against or seems to go against their favorite team. Say a referee makes a close call against your team. The reaction is, he's got to be wrong. The ref is on the take, he's blind, got to be a bad call. If the call goes in favor of your team, on the other hand, well, of course that call was correct. How could it have been any other way? If you doubt me, the book actually cites social science studies that look at how sports fans react to calls against their team, and they come out much the same way that you would expect. And this is exactly the way the political fans react to new political information. They overvalue and overestimate anything that supports their pre-existing view, while ignoring or at least discounting anything that cuts the other way. Moreover, most political fans, the people most interested in politics, they tend to only discuss politics with other people who have similar views, conservative Republicans with other Republicans, Democrats with other Democrats, and so forth. And they tend to follow politics in news sources that have the same views. So conservatives, for example, will tend to watch Fox News, liberals listen to NPR and watch MSNBC and so forth. So if your goal is to get at the truth, this is highly illogical behavior. If you're a real truth seeker, to the contrary, as John Stuart Mill pointed out, what you want to do is seek out information sources that have points of view different from your own. They're the ones that are most likely to give you arguments and evidence that you haven't heard before. If, on the other hand, the goal here is not to get at the truth, but to enhance your fan experience, to feel good about yourself, to reinforce your pre-existing views, then it actually makes perfect sense, this sort of behavior. Economist Brian Kaplan calls it rational irrationality. When your goal in seeking out information is not primarily to get at the truth, but to achieve some other sort of end, it might be very rational from the standpoint of your own objectives to be illogical and biased in the way that you seek out information and the way that you process it. So what you have here is a two-level problem of political ignorance. Most people are just rationally ignorant. They have no incentive to follow politics, so they don't keep up with the issues and know very little about them. There is a minority, the political fans, who know much more than the average person, but they tend to be highly biased in the way that they process the information, so they're often not able to use their knowledge to actually make good decisions about which candidates and policies are best. Now, despite this kind of evidence, some scholars say, don't worry, be happy. Why? Because even the voters, they may not know much, but they have information shortcuts that can help them out. So, for example, maybe they don't know much about politics, but they have knowledge from everyday life. For example, they operate a business, for instance, and if business is going badly, that might mean that the economy is in bad shape, and in turn, that might mean that the current politicians in power are doing badly, or even that they're stupid losers, as Donald Trump might say. And there are some other shortcuts like this in the literature. The one that is best known, that has the most evidence, is what scholars call retrospective voting, well encapsulated by Ronald Reagan's famous statement during the 1980 election. He said, if you want to decide who to vote for in this election, all you're going to do is ask, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? If you are better off, then you can vote to re-elect the incumbent, and he will continue his good policies. If you were worse off, and of course Reagan knew that most people thought they were worse off, then you should throw the bastards out, and then you can elect a different set of bastards, but the new bastards will have an incentive to improve things because they know that if things keep getting worse, the electorate can vote them out in their turn 4 years from now or 2 years from now in the case of members of Congress. I think there's something to this idea of retrospective voting. In some cases where the incumbents have screwed up in a really big and obvious way, the electorate will punish them, and that does provide them some incentives not to make those sorts of mistakes in the first place. But retrospective voting also has two weaknesses that generalize to other information shortcuts as well. One is that in order to be a good retrospective voter, you often need pre-existing information that most voters do not have. For example, you may need to know what issues it is that the incumbent politicians are actually responsible for. If you don't know that, you will end up rewarding them and punishing them for stuff they did not really cause. And unfortunately, that's exactly what tends to happen. The biggest determinant of most electoral outcomes is the short-term state of the economy. How is the economy doing in the 6 months or year right prior to the election? If it's improving, the incumbents will tend to win. If it's getting worse, they'll tend to lose. Even though most economists will tell you there's not much evidence that politicians have a lot of control over short-term economic trends. Their policies do have important long-term effects, but the short-term economic change usually determined by forces that the politicians have very little control over. Even worse, perhaps, there are many other things that politicians have little control over that nonetheless affect elections. One example is that when there is a drought in a farm state, farm production falls, the governor is likely to be defeated for re-election, even though obviously he didn't cause it. Similarly, victories by local sports teams increase the chances that the mayor will be re-elected, even though in most cases he doesn't play on the team, he doesn't coach it, doesn't have much effect, but he still gets credit for their victories. Similarly, in coastal communities, when there's an increase in shark attacks, if Jaws comes out and takes a bite out of a swimmer, that's bad news for local politicians. On the other hand, there are many things that politicians do have an effect on that the voters don't notice because they're unaware of them, and then therefore they don't reward and punish them for their performance. The other big flaw with information shortcuts is that in addition to needing knowledge that you might not have, the information shortcut only works well if people are using it to try to get at the truth, as opposed to engaging in biased thinking of the kind that we see with rational irrationality. And unfortunately, the latter often tends to happen. For example, when a Democrat is in the White House, Republicans tend to think that the rate of inflation and unemployment is much higher than they actually are. And Democrats have the opposite kind of bias. They think things are better than they actually are when a Democrat's in the White House, and the opposite with a Republican. You might say, well, we swing voters don't have this kind of bias. That's true, but the swing voters are also the ones who tend to be the most ignorant to begin with, so it's not much, it's maybe less biased, but they're also making poor judgments as well. And so the big problems with shortcuts are, first, you need pre-existing knowledge to use them effectively often. If you don't have it, often you'll make things worse. And second, often instead of using the shortcuts as an objective way to get at the truth, what we instead do is we allow our biases to infect the way we use the shortcuts, and therefore we actually make things worse. Now, a natural response to this kind of evidence to say what we need to do is increase people's knowledge. In the book, I devote an entire chapter to why I think we're unlikely to succeed in that in the foreseeable future. I'm very happy to talk about that in questions, But for now, I'm going to press on to conclude with something that I think can improve the situation, which is increasing our ability to vote with our feet and limiting the number of decisions that we make at the ballot box. What do I mean by voting with our feet? Well, I think we can do so in two ways. One is, in a federal system, we can vote with our feet by moving from one town to another or one state to another, often depending on the kind of government policies they have, the taxes, the schools, crime rates, employment opportunities, and so forth. We can also vote with our feet in the private sector when we decide what products to buy, what organization to join, like Liberty Pub, for example, what churches or synagogues to attend, and so forth. And you might say, when we vote with our feet, why is that any better than voting at the ballot box? Why would that be any better from an informational point of view? In both cases, you need to get information, and you need to evaluate it in at least a somewhat logical way. The answer is that there is a big difference in the incentives that people have in these kinds of settings. Think about this. If you're like most people, you probably spent more time and effort acquiring information the last time you decided what car or TV set to buy than the last time you decided who to vote for president or for any other political office. Now, is this because your TV set is more important than the presidency or deals with more complicated issues in the federal government? No, it's because most likely you spent more time on the TV because you knew that that decision would actually make a difference. The TV you pick is the one that will actually end up in your living room. Whereas when you switch on the TV and you see the president talking in a press conference, the chance that your vote will determine who that president is, that chance is 1 in 60 million, and therefore you devote less time and effort to it. The same applies not just to your incentive to acquire information, but to your incentive to logically evaluate it in an unbiased manner. Think about the following social norm that I'm sure many of you have run into. If you go to a party, it's considered bad manners to argue about politics in mixed company. If you go to a party, you come up to a person, and you start correcting the flaws in their political views, they probably won't thank you for your efforts. Indeed, they might get very annoyed, they'll be very angry at you, and they'll tend to react that way, even if you have devastating arguments which brilliantly refute whatever it is that they believed before. They probably won't be too happy. If you want to be a popular and well-liked person who gets invited to all the cool parties, you don't want to be the kind of person that starts political arguments. Believe me, I know from painful personal experience, this is not the way to become popular. On the other hand, if you come up to those same people and you give them new information that's relevant to a foot voting decision, like what community to live in, what car to buy, they'll probably have a very different reaction. They'll be much more open to what you have to say, and you're much less likely to be kicked out of the party for your efforts. Now, why the difference is because for most people, hearing their political views dissected and criticized is all pain for very little gain. They suffer the discomfort of having their views questioned. If the other person has a better or stronger argument, they may look stupid, and yet all they gain at best is better knowledge for a decision that has only a tiny chance of making a difference anyway. On the other hand, with the foot voting information, that's news that you can actually use. You might buy a better TV or a better car, or have a better decision on where you want to live. So people are not only seek out more information for those decisions, but when they do so, they use the information better. They're more unbiased when they judge it. Now, what are some of the implications of this, the informational advantages of foot voting over ballot box voting? One is that you may want to decentralize government. If government is decentralized to state or to local level, you can make more decisions by foot voting. If you don't like the policies of your town, it's relatively easy often to move to a neighboring community. If you don't like the policy of your state, it's harder to move, but it's still easier than moving out of the nation entirely. Similarly, you may also want to leave more decisions to the private sector. In the private sector, we can vote with our feet, often without even having to physically move at all. We can buy a new product, send our kids to a different private school, join a new church or synagogue, and so forth, all without having to physically move, and you can have actually a wider range of choices even in a federal system. Won't be perfect, you won't be perfectly well informed, you'll still make mistakes, but on the whole, you will do better than you do when you vote at the ballot box. So what you would want to do, therefore, is limit and decentralize government power to a greater extent than you would otherwise. Now, I hasten to add, this does not prove that you want the maximum possible decentralization or the tightest possible limits on government power. Obviously, political ignorance is not the only thing you want to factor in when you decide how centralized government should be or how broad its powers should be. But it's something where if you recognize that political ignorance is a serious problem, you would want government to be more limited and more decentralized than you would want it to be if you thought you lived in a world where voters are well informed and they do a great job of making decisions. Moreover, other things equal, the problem of voter ignorance should lower your confidence in claims that government is likely to do a good job solving a particular problem. If this is the sort of problem where the influence of ignorant voters might well screw up what government will do, then your confidence should be at least somewhat diminished. Maybe you'll still want government to be active in this area, but the threshold of proof that government action should pass would be higher than it might otherwise be. In the book, I also talk about why the problem of political ignorance strengthens the case for strong judicial review and for limiting the power of government in this particular way. I'm happy to talk about it in questions, but for now I'll conclude, and I very much look forward to the discussion. Thank you so much. Should I call in people, or are you going to?
All right, I'll pass the mic. So, Ron, do you have a question?
Sure.
Is this my one?
Yes.
You said that political ignorance is bad. Therefore, if we're discussing what nomination methods we should use methods which have higher information voters voting in them?
Possibly. Obviously, what's happened in this year's election, particularly on the GOP side, has led many people to think, maybe it was a bad idea to have a popular election process for choosing a nominee. Maybe we should go back to the smoke-filled rooms, maybe without the smoke, where sort of politically weak choose the candidates, and maybe that would be a good thing to do. I'm more inclined in that direction myself than perhaps I used to be. But there's still a problem in that even in the smoke-filled room days, so to speak, the people in those rooms had to choose a candidate and a platform that they thought would appeal to the relatively ignorant electorate that votes in a general election. And so the problem of political ignorance will not go away simply with a less populist nominating process. And you might say maybe the solution is, and many people throughout history have said this, is that we want to limit eligibility for a franchise more generally so that only relatively more knowledgeable people get to vote. We already do this to some extent. We forbid voting by children. We forbid voting by immigrants, even legal immigrants, unless they can pass a civics test that most native-born Americans would fail. So you can say, let's extend that. Maybe we should have that same test apply to everybody. Maybe we should have other mechanisms of limiting the franchise. In the book, I discuss this at some length. I'm not optimistic that we can solve the problem that way. Among other things, I'm not optimistic we can trust government to select a mechanism of limiting the franchise that it will, in fact, screen out ignorance as opposed to merely benefit the incumbent politicians who set the policy. But I'm not on principle as opposed to considering these sorts of approaches as many people are. I think if you already believe that it's okay to disenfranchise children, 20 or 30% of our population, because in our view they're not knowledgeable enough or don't have good enough judgment to cast good votes, then if disenfranchising 20% is okay, I don't think there's a principled objection to say, well, why not 25%? Why not knock out the most ignorant, say, 5% of the adult voters? There may be good prudential reasons why we shouldn't do this, but I don't view it as an intrinsic matter of principle that I think it's flawed to say, well, it's perfectly fine to eliminate all 17-year-olds from a franchise, but if we do the same thing with 19-year-olds, or even only those 19-year-olds who are particularly ignorant, that's terrible. I think that's somewhat of an arbitrary distinction.
Do you want to grab the mic real quick?
We're recording, so
Yeah, so first of all, I definitely invite you to any party that I'd have, so that's just a fact. But I guess there's like, it's a lot of problems. I think you're preaching to the choir here in terms of like low information voters and limited government. The way I see it, it's kind of like a turnout question, I guess, because so few people actually turn out to vote in the first place. So is the solution, I guess I'm looking for solutions, is it to somehow have like a good way of just getting the right people to like actually turn out and vote, or is it a different form of government? Because like, I don't think we're ever going to solve this problem. I want to read your book, so I definitely want to like learn more. But as I'm just like looking for like some kind of a solution to the actual problem that we're facing today.
So first, thanks for the party invitation. I don't get too many of those. Second, obviously it is a difficult problem. If it were easy, I wouldn't have written a book about it because it would have probably been solved already. I'm skeptical that the solution is to try to get some sort of selective turnout, in that the turnout currently in presidential elections is about 55 to 60%. In off-year election, it's more like 40 or even 45%. Those who turn out probably are better informed than those who do not, which suggests that one thing we might want to do is rethink whether we really want to have higher turnout. I'm not saying there should be legal barriers to it, or that we should have voter ID laws or sort of artificial restrictions and the like. All I'm saying is that we should ask, do we actually want to go out of our way to encourage every year turnout, even if knowing at the margin that would tend to decrease the quality of the electorate, even if we don't want to put up legal barriers. I think in many cases we probably don't, because the government can't be trusted on it. We at least might want to rethink our social ethos. So do we want to encourage everybody to turn out, or do we want to say you should turn out if you're a responsible citizen, i.e. a person who's put in at least a reasonable effort into learning about the issues? What can we do more broadly to solve the problem? As I mentioned in my talk, I think we can limit and decentralize government. You might ask, well, how do we persuade the electorate to do that? The very fact that they're ignorant may make it difficult to persuade them to adopt even good reforms. There's certainly, quite understandably, most of them are not going to take the time, not just to read my book, but to read most serious works on law and policy. So I think it's a difficult problem, but there are a couple of ways that we might be able to approach it. One is, the public does have a deep distrust of government and politicians. If you look at trust in different professions, politicians are down there below even my fellow lawyers in terms of how much people distrust them. And also trust in government has been falling for several decades for the most part, with a brief period right after 9/11 when it rose for a while, but then it started falling again. So sadly, often that distrust gets channeled into saying, well, if only we elected the right person, the person who will bring change we can believe in, or the person who will make America great again or whatnot, then we can solve our problems. But we might be able to channel that distrust into measures to limit the power of government more generally, rather than to just transfer it to a different set of hands. If you look historically, for most of the history of the Western world, one thing that most people thought government definitely should be doing is promoting the right religion. It's not just a matter of life and death, it's a matter of life after death too. Your soul could be saved if you believe in the right religion, but over the last 100 or 200 years, most people in the West at least, and even many people elsewhere, have recognized that this is actually not a good thing for government to be involved in, not because religion isn't important, but because government, including democratic government, tends to make bad decisions in this area. And maybe we can make similar realizations about other areas, or at the very least, realizations about how maybe the total amount of government activity could be similar, but it can be more decentralized. If, for instance, a country like Switzerland or Denmark and New Zealand, some of the better run governments in the world according to most metrics, if they can have their own healthcare policy, their own education policy, and so forth, then why not Virginia or California or Massachusetts or other American states which are about the same size as some of these countries? We can decentralize, and you don't have to be a radical libertarian, certainly not as radical as I am, to be willing to support that. Switzerland is not a fully libertarian state by any means, but it's reasonably well run. Same thing with New Zealand, Denmark, and so forth. And by the way, in many cases, they combine this with a high degree of mobility inside and outside of the country. Swiss, for the most part, are able to move around to other places in Europe and live there if they want to. Other Europeans often can migrate freely to Switzerland. It works reasonably well. We can imitate this kind of success by decentralizing power within our system, even if you don't agree with the objective of limiting the amount of government power more generally. Many of the things we currently do in Washington can be done by Virginia, by North Carolina, by California and Texas, and so forth.
Hi, Carl Donovan. I think I give a domain reference, endthefed.info. And that domain is actually forwarded to a text on constitutional monetary reform. If I could just interject a concept that decentralization and the disempowering of the government, which is largely a tool of corporatism, using Federal Reserve credit, perpetually expanding credit as the engine to that corporatism. The Constitution says no state shall make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debt. That honest unit of account lent itself to a decentralized system where a community could almost be defined by the fact that money would coalesce and circulate, where all the various business activities and daily acts of life just reinforced one another and were in service to one another. And the message to this is, at the state and local level, if we educate our local officials that Federal Reserve credit is not constitutional money, it's not even redeemable on demand from the issuer in honest species coined money. That I was in traffic court a couple years ago for making a left turn during rush hour, someplace you're not allowed to. And I used the technique advocated by this mode of monetary reform. When the judge, my case was called, I said, Your Honor, yes, I did make the left turn. I just, as to sentencing, I object to being fined in a unconstitutional Federal Reserve unit of credit. And so he just passed over. He said, well, pay court costs and take traffic school if you don't have any points, and no fine. Now, I had heard the 30 cases before me, everyone was fined $50 or $100. And it's interesting, there's a recognition in the judicial system that our system of Federal Reserve credit isn't inherently legitimate, and it's really an empowering of centralized government and the largest corporations. So, my question, I guess, would be monetary reform. As the Federal Reserve's 100 years have served to just centralize and corrupt through a political currency. What do you think about monetary reform?
So here I have to plead my own ignorance to some extent. Monetary policy is an extremely complicated issue where I don't have very much expertise, so I'm not going to try to give advice on what should be done in that area. Obviously, there are some economists, particularly some libertarian economists, who say we should decentralize control over money. We should have free banking, for example. The issue of private currencies, Bitcoin might be an example of this. Other economists say no, there's a lot of value having a single common currency over a wide territory, and I don't have enough knowledge to sort of adjudicate that in any kind of intelligent way. I think there are some issues which are genuinely difficult where sort of a general idea of limiting and decentralizing government power doesn't by itself tell you what you should do. But there's also a lot of low-hanging fruit in government policy where there's a lot of evidence that decentralization and limitation can serve us well with relatively few downsides. I already mentioned things like education and healthcare and other things. There we can certainly decentralize much more than we currently do, even if you can argue about whether we should have multiple currencies as opposed to a single dominant one. Lastly, regarding corporate interest, I certainly agree corporate interests and other special interests get away with a lot of stuff through government, but I think here too, voter ignorance plays a big role in that if the voters had more knowledge of what is going on, if they didn't like the benefits that corporate interests were getting, they could easily vote out those politicians and vote in ones that would do things differently. In reality, much of the time, corporate interests get away with stuff either because the government activity in question is one that the voters simply don't know much about, like our very harmful farm subsidies, for example. Or alternatively, the special interests manage to benefit because the counterproductive policies that they prefer are actually popular with the voters, like protectionism, for instance. There are clearly corporate interests that benefit from shutting out foreign competition, auto manufacturers, for instance, and others. But the dominant force in why we have more protectionism than we should is less the fact that these corporate interests have manipulated things, but that most voters don't understand very basic economics. If they did understand it, not saying the corporate interests would never get away with anything, but they would get away with a lot less, and the same thing would be true for a lot of other interest groups as well.
We'll go up the back here real quick. Try to time with these three.
You touched on something in a different way that I was thinking of, but about like shortcuts voters use. And I realized something that has kind of went by the wayside, it seems to me, in the past few decades. It seemed to me that for a long time, voters might not have known much about policies, but they put a great deal of stock in the character, perhaps, of politicians. And now I think you can make an excellent case for the type of people they thought were virtuous people that were not. Nonetheless, it seems, I'm not trying to be partisan here, but especially since Clinton, the idea that character doesn't matter, it's all about, the result and policy, has sort of become more dominant. And while I admit the character does not necessarily lead to good policies, it seems to me that that was a barrier to, especially right now, what I consider two incredibly poor character politicians having the nomination of major parties. I guess I just wanted you to comment on, do you think that is a factor that has led to increased problems because of voter ignorance? Because that used to mollify it in some way.
It's a good question. In the book, I do talk at some length about what scholars call the Burkean trusteeship theory of political participation, named after Edmund Burke, who first formalized the idea in the 18th century. And what Burke and other people think along these lines say, what the voters should be doing is not thinking about policy, but thinking about the character and qualifications of the candidate. If this is a good person with good judgment, let him or her make the complex policy decisions, and we can then be confident that they'll do a reasonably good job. I think there's a couple of problems with this. One is, it turns out with most candidates for office, candidates for president are an exception, but most, the voters barely even know their names, much less know much about their character and background. A second problem is that it's actually not always easy to figure out what character traits will make you a good political leader for a particular type of office. For instance, you said, and to some extent I agree, Bill Clinton was a person with poor character. That is, he cheated on his wife, he lied about a lot of things. Did that necessarily make him a bad president? Well, maybe, but I think you can make a pretty good case that even though he was a bad person, he was a good president, at least in some of his policies. Similarly, you could make a good case and say Thomas Jefferson was a good president, even though he owned slaves and he did a number of other questionable things in his personal life. On the other hand, some politicians who in their personal lives in some ways have good character, George W. Bush is an example, maybe weren't so successful in the presidency. So the question of what sorts of character traits actually make you a good president or a good senator or a good governor, it's arguable, and to have an informed opinion on that, you need to know some things about the office, about the performance of past presidents. You need pre-existing knowledge to use this shortcoming to use this shortcut effectively, and to understand whether it really is a shortcoming or not. We're going to take another example. Donald Trump says, I'm a great businessman, therefore I will be a great president as well. Assume for the sake of argument that he really is a great businessman. Do the same skills that make you a great businessman translate into being a great president? Well, maybe, but it's not obvious. And to have an informed opinion about that, you need to know something about what sorts of skills and character traits make you a successful businessman, and are they really the same ones as make you a good politician or a good president. So I think focusing on character doesn't make the problem of political ignorance go away. If anything, once you think about it, it turns out you need a whole different kind of knowledge that many voters might not have. At the very least, you need to know the names of the candidates and what their backgrounds are, and for most offices, much of the electorate doesn't even know that much.
Thank you for coming tonight. I'm always curious about, you sort of described the emotional effect of being around friends, and you certainly achieved that probably tonight, most of the audience probably agrees with you. So give us the benefit of the discussions you had with the adversaries. When you talk about decentralizing government, you don't have many friends in the interest category, the lobbying category. You're really taking on lots and lots of groups, lots and lots of interests, and saying, hey, how about you ramp down your power a little bit? And that seems like it's very good, very counterintuitive. So I guess the question is twofold. One, at the intellectual level, what kind of discourse have you had? And secondly, at the practical level, what sort of positive direction incentives would any Joe Congressman, junior congressman on the Hill say, yes, I want to go in that direction because, which would sort of illustrate the practical effect of moving voters in this sort of direction?
Really two interesting questions. One is sort of the first question, what sort of intellectual objections do I get? Obviously, I've devoted large parts of the book to them where I discuss many of them at great length. One I already mentioned, many scholars believe information shortcuts work very well, and therefore political ignorance isn't so much of a problem. I gave you a capsule summary of my response to that. In the book, I go through many other information shortcuts in addition to retrospective voting. I also go into more complicated academic theories which say that even if individuals don't use shortcuts very well, in the aggregate, the voters come up to good decisions because a mistake in one direction will be canceled out by mistakes in another direction. I explain, I think, great considerable detail in the book why I think this is not true. The more common set of objections, particularly from people who aren't academics, is people who say, well, I agree with you, there's a problem of political ignorance, but decentralizing and limiting government power isn't the right solution because various bad things will happen. For example, some people say, well, if you decentralize, only the rich will benefit, only the rich will be able to effectively vote with your feet. My answer is that history suggests precisely the opposite. In reality, throughout most of history, a lot of the foot voters, those who used it most effectively, were actually the poor and the oppressed. Think of poor European and Asian immigrants voting with their feet to come to the U.S. Think of African Americans leaving the Jim Crow South to come to the North, where things were at least relatively better. Many other examples throughout history. Moreover, if your goal simply is to redistribute resources to the poor and the disadvantaged, you can do that without having anything like as large and as centralized a government as we currently have. And in the book, I discuss some ways that you can do this. There are also a wide range of other arguments that could be made and that I have answers to. That's why I wrote an entire book as opposed to gave a 20-minute talk. But for what it's worth, I do spend a lot of my time dealing with scholars and others who have very different views. I'm in academia. Right-of-center people, whether conservative or libertarian, are only about 10 or 15% of the people in my profession. Over 80% are people on the left, many of whom are suspicious of either one or the other part of the thing I argue for here, so I do spend a lot of time discussing things with them. Your second part of your question is, well, what would I say to a congressman or some other political leader who wants to engage in sort of short-term political strategy on this? My answer is, in general, my short-term political strategy is not my area of expertise, so I'm cautious about the kinds of advice that I give here. What I argue for is ways that in the medium to long term we can change the climate of opinion such that these kinds of reforms would be more feasible. But there are many areas where existing office holders can make improvements at the margin, precisely because the voters don't actually watch them all that closely. There is a good deal of room for discretion, so we can cut some spending there, have some degree of decentralization there. And in many areas, we can do this in ways that can perhaps cut across partisan lines. So to give just one example, there is now a sort of growing understanding on both the left and the right that maybe we don't want to have the war on drugs on the same scale as we currently have, either because on the right people say it's too centralized, it costs a lot of money, we end up putting a lot of people in prison where it's not cost effective to have them there. Many conservatives at the state level in particular will come to recognize this. And on the left, of course, they say this disproportionately affects minorities and the poor and it harms them in various ways. So that's an opportunity to have reforms there. Another one is one thing that makes it harder for people to vote with their feet is restrictive zoning, which in many jurisdictions drives up the cost of housing, particularly for the poor and the working class, much more than it needs to be. Experts on the right have recognized this for a long time. Many on the left have come to see it as well. The Obama administration, Council of Economic Advisors, actually had an excellent report on this just last fall. I urge you to look it up on their website. So here, there's an opportunity for cooperation between experts and political elites on different sides, and possibly, perhaps, although this will be difficult, to get ordinary voters to have more of a sense of this as well. So I'm pessimistic we'll have some great revolution in the near future, but I think we can make incremental change in public opinion, and there are also areas where in the meantime, elites, experts, and others can make a difference in areas where public opinion doesn't monitor things closely. I'll end the answer with this. I know the answer is over long, but those were two complex questions there, so I plead some excuse. That there are other countries which have done this. Countries like Canada, New Zealand, Ireland, and others have in fact significantly limited the size and scope of government in recent decades. And we ourselves had some success in this regard as recently as the 1990s. So while I'm pessimistic that society in the short to medium term can be anywhere near as libertarian or decentralized as I personally would like it to be, I do think there's room for good incremental progress that, even though it won't give us everything that I might think is desirable, it can make a lot of people's lives better than they currently are, and also it can make the problem of political ignorance less of a menace, at least at the margin.
All right, last question.
Similar to the earlier question, being more educated or more informed doesn't guarantee virtuous decisions at the ballot box. So in your research, were there any other factors about voters and not about candidates that stuck out to you? Any trends?
Yeah, so obviously, you're good. There's a large literature on voting decisions and what determines them, and I'm certainly not saying that knowledge and ignorance is the only factor, but knowledge and ignorance is a big factor in that if you control for demographic and other variables, race, sex, partisanship, income, more knowledgeable voters tend to have different views. They tend to be, on the whole, more in favor of limiting government in both the economic and social spheres. They tend to be more tolerant of religious and ethnic minorities, and have been so for a long time, and also of gays and lesbians. They also tend to favor policies that at least are somewhat more coherent. They're not more libertarian in every area or more right, I think, in every area, but on the whole, I think they're better, and even when they favor policies that I personally think are bad ones, and that certainly happens a lot of the time. I'm certainly not suggesting that all the knowledgeable voters favor all the things that I do, nowhere close. But they often at least favor more intelligent versions of the policies in question. So they might want to redistribute more income to the poor than I might want to, but they're willing to do it in more intelligent ways instead of trying to do it by having tariffs or by having a very high minimum wage, which might put people in unemployment. They're more willing to have things like the earned income tax credit, which is a much more painless and effective way to redistribute money to the poor. And there are other examples like this. So voter knowledge is not the only thing that has an effect, but it has a big effect. I do recognize, and I have a section of the book devoted to this, that there are unusual circumstances where more knowledge can actually make things worse. Like if you have, for instance, really evil voters with really evil values, then if they're more knowledgeable, they can more effectively figure out ways to get the politician to the evil things that they like. But such cases are exceptional, and a lot of what looks like evil values to us may actually be an example of ignorance. even people who on the surface favor, say, racist or homophobic or other evil policies, which I decry, often if you ask them, why do you favor this, their answer is not, I hate black people just because I hate them, or I hate the Jews because I hate them. Rather, they will tell you a story of how blacks or Jews, or whatever other group it is harming their group. And that story will, in most cases, be based on ignorance and illogic, but it's a story they believe. I'm not saying that if people were more knowledgeable, we would never have had racism or anti-Semitism, not at all, but we would have had a lot less of it. About a month ago, I wrote a column for the History News Network where I talked about how what your elementary school teacher told you about prejudice being the result of ignorance, she was more right than you might think about that. A lot of racial, ethnic, religious, and other prejudice, a lot of what seems like bad values often is the result of ignorance. That's not necessarily comforting to the victims of it, but it's an important thing to understand nonetheless if you want to figure out why these things happen and what we can perhaps do to prevent it.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, for coming out. Thank you to Ilya for a great talk. Quick thank you, not much, for our Liberty Club Bob, listening to see you here.